The world held its breath this morning. In a move that stunned military officials, shocked allies, and triggered immediate global alarm, former U.S. President Donald Trump has reportedly ordered the sudden abandonment of multiple American military bases across the Middle East. No warning, no gradual withdrawal, no coordinated transition, just a rapid disengagement from one of the most strategically volatile regions on Earth. Within hours of the report surfacing, defense analysts began raising the same question. What happens when a superpower steps back in the middle of a conflict zone? According to early intelligence signals and regional confirmations, U.S. personnel have begun pulling out from key installations, bases that, until now, served as critical hubs for air operations, intelligence gathering, and counterterrorism missions. Locations believed to be affected include forward operating positions in Iraq and Syria, areas that have long acted as buffers against both extremist resurgence and regional escalation. The speed of the withdrawal is what has triggered the deepest concern. Because in geopolitics, timing is everything. And this timing could not be more dangerous. The Middle East is already balancing on a razor's edge, ongoing tensions between Iran and U.S.-aligned forces, proxy conflicts stretching across Syria and Yemen, and a fragile security architecture that depends heavily on American presence to maintain equilibrium. Now that equilibrium is shifting. Fast. Within Washington, early reactions point to confusion. Senior defense officials are reportedly scrambling to assess the operational fallout. Allies are demanding clarity, and adversaries watching closely may already be recalculating their next move. Because when power vacuums emerge in geopolitics, they rarely stay empty for long. They get filled, and often not by friendly forces. The implications of this decision extend far beyond the Middle East. Global oil markets have already begun reacting. Intelligence agencies are raising alert levels. And diplomatic channels, once stable, are now flooded with urgent back-and-forth communication. This isn't just a withdrawal. It's a signal that could redefine alliances, reshape conflict zones, and potentially trigger a chain reaction no one can fully control. But the most critical question remains unanswered. Why now? What forced this decision? Was it strategic or reactive? Calculated or rushed? Because depending on that answer, the consequences could range from controlled repositioning to the early stages of a much larger global confrontation. If you want to understand what's really happening behind the headlines and how this could impact global stability in the coming days, make sure you subscribe now. Because this story is still unfolding, and what comes next may change everything. To understand the magnitude of this sudden withdrawal, it is essential to step back far beyond the breaking headlines and examine how the United States became so deeply embedded in the Middle East in the first place. This is not a story that began overnight. It is the result of decades of strategic decisions, military interventions, shifting alliances, and unresolved conflicts that have gradually shaped one of the most complex geopolitical landscapes in modern history. The foundation was laid in the aftermath of the Cold War, when the United States emerged as the dominant global power. The Middle East, rich in energy resources and strategically positioned between Europe, Asia, and Africa, quickly became a central focus of American foreign policy. Then came a turning point. September 11, 2001, the attacks on U.S. soil triggered a massive military response, launching what would become known as the War on Terror. Within weeks, U.S. forces entered Afghanistan. By 2003, Iraq became the next major theater of operations. This marked the beginning of a long-term military presence, one that would eventually expand into a network of bases, forward operating positions, and intelligence hubs across Iraq, Syria, the Gulf states, and beyond. These bases were not just symbolic. They served as critical nodes in a vast operational system: airstrikes against extremist groups, surveillance over hostile territories, rapid response capabilities for emerging threats. Over time, however, the mission began to evolve. By the mid-2010s, the focus had shifted toward combating ISIS, which had rapidly seized large parts of Iraq and Syria. U.S. bases became essential in coordinating coalition forces, supporting local militias, and maintaining pressure on the group's remaining strongholds. But even as ISIS began to lose territory, a new layer of tension was emerging: Iran. Through a network of allied militias and regional influence, Iran expanded its footprint across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. This created a shadow conflict, one that rarely erupted into direct confrontation, but constantly simmered beneath the surface. Then came a series of flashpoints. 2019, attacks on oil tankers in the Gulf. 2020, the U.S. strike that killed Iranian General Qasem Soleimani. Retaliatory missile strikes on U.S. bases in Iraq. Each moment pushed the region closer to open conflict. And yet, despite these tensions, U.S. forces remained. Not in massive invasion numbers, but in strategic positions designed to deter escalation and maintain balance. Then, another shift. Domestic pressure inside the United States began to grow. Questions emerged about the cost of maintaining overseas bases. Political leaders across administrations debated whether continued presence was necessary or sustainable. Gradually, discussions of withdrawal became more frequent. But even then, any drawdown was expected to be calculated, phased, coordinated with allies. Not sudden, not immediate, not destabilizing. Which brings us to now. Reports of an abrupt abandonment of bases do not align with the long-established pattern of U.S. military disengagement. Historically, even partial withdrawals involved months of planning, logistical coordination, and diplomatic communication. This time, something appears different, because when a decades-long military presence begins to unravel in a matter of hours or days, it suggests either a dramatic strategic shift or a rapidly evolving crisis behind the scenes. And as multiple actors across the region begin to respond, one reality becomes clear. This is not just the end of a chapter. It may be the beginning of something far more unpredictable. The sequence of events began quietly. No major announcement, no formal press briefing, no immediate confirmation from senior leadership. Instead, the first signals emerged through fragmented reports, regional observers noting unusual troop movements, local sources describing sudden evacuations, and satellite imagery suggesting rapid changes at known U.S. military installations. Then within hours, the pattern became undeniable. Convoys were seen leaving key bases. Aircraft activity spiked, transport planes moving personnel and equipment. Security perimeters, once heavily guarded, appeared partially abandoned. This was not routine rotation. This was a withdrawal, and it was happening fast. According to initial field reports, U.S. forces began pulling out from multiple strategic points across Iraq and eastern Syria, areas long considered essential to maintaining operational reach in the region. Some bases reportedly transitioned to minimal staffing, while others were left entirely in the hands of local partner forces. But even those transitions appeared rushed. In several locations, reports indicate that allied militias and regional forces were given little notice, raising concerns about coordination breakdowns on the ground. From Washington, the messaging was inconsistent. One line of communication suggested a strategic repositioning, framing the movement as part of a broader shift in military posture. Another implied security concerns, pointing to rising threats against U.S. personnel as a possible trigger for rapid disengagement. Yet neither explanation fully accounted for the speed. And in geopolitics, speed often signals pressure. On one side of the narrative, U.S. officials, both current and former, have emphasized force protection. Intelligence warnings, they suggest, may have indicated an imminent risk to American troops, necessitating immediate action to avoid potential casualties. This version frames the withdrawal as defensive, calculated under urgency. But on the other side, regional actors are telling a very different story. Some Iraqi officials have described the move as abrupt and destabilizing, arguing that it leaves critical security gaps in areas still vulnerable to insurgent activity. Syrian observers warn that extremist groups, though weakened, remain capable of exploiting sudden power vacuums. And then there is the Iranian perspective. State-aligned voices have portrayed the withdrawal as a strategic retreat, evidence, they claim, of declining U.S. influence in the region. In this narrative, the move is not defensive, but forced, a response to sustained pressure from regional resistance networks. Caught between these competing interpretations lies a complicated reality. There is evidence to support elements of both narratives. Increased militia activity targeting U.S. positions in recent weeks. And there's a heightened intelligence chatter suggesting possible escalation. Growing political pressure domestically to reduce overseas military commitments. But there are also critical unknowns. What specific threat triggered this timeline? Was there a single event or a buildup of multiple risks? And perhaps most importantly, was this withdrawal planned in advance or executed in response to something still hidden from public view? Because the absence of clarity is not just a communication issue. It is a strategic risk. When allies are uncertain, coordination weakens. When adversaries are uncertain, miscalculation becomes more likely. And in a region where multiple armed actors operate in close proximity, often with conflicting objectives, that uncertainty can escalate quickly. What began as a series of quiet movements is now a full-scale geopolitical question, not just about what happened, but about what it means. And as the dust begins to settle around these abandoned positions, one thing is becoming increasingly clear. The real consequences of this decision may not be immediate. They may unfold over days, weeks, or even months. And by then, the balance of power on the ground could look very different. To understand why this sudden withdrawal has triggered such intense global concern, you have to look beyond the headlines and focus on what these bases actually represent. Because these are not just isolated military outposts. They are the backbone of a much larger strategic architecture. For years, U.S. bases across Iraq and Syria have served as critical command nodes, linking surveillance systems, coordinating air operations, and enabling rapid deployment across multiple conflict zones. From these locations, the United States has been able to monitor extremist movements, deter hostile actors, and maintain a constant operational presence in one of the most volatile regions in the world. Remove those nodes, and the entire system begins to weaken. Take eastern Syria, for example. This region sits at the intersection of multiple strategic corridors bordering Iraq, positioned near key and neft routes, and acting as a geographic buffer between Iranian-aligned forces and U.S.-backed partners. American bases in this area have functioned as both a physical barrier and a surveillance hub, limiting the free movement of hostile militias. Now, with that presence reduced or removed, those corridors may begin to open, and that changes everything. In Iraq, the situation is equally complex. U.S. installations have long supported intelligence sharing and counterterrorism coordination with Iraqi forces. While ISIS no longer controls major cities, its network has not disappeared. It has adapted, shifting to insurgency tactics, exploiting weak points, and waiting for opportunities to re-emerge. A sudden reduction in U.S. operational support could create exactly that opportunity, but the strategic implications go even deeper. These bases have also played a key role in counterbalancing Iranian influence. Through a network of allied militias and regional partners, Iran has steadily expanded its footprint across the Middle East. U.S. positions have acted as a limiting force, preventing that influence from becoming unchecked. Without that counterweight, the regional balance could shift. Not instantly, but steadily, and potentially in ways that are difficult to reverse. Then there is the air power factor. Many of these bases support drone operations, reconnaissance flights, and rapid strike capabilities. They allow for real-time monitoring of threats and immediate response when necessary. Losing access or even reducing presence means slower reaction times, less visibility, and greater uncertainty. From a military perspective, that is a significant downgrade. But perhaps the most critical element is perception. In geopolitics, actions send signals. And the signal being interpreted right now by allies and adversaries alike is that the United States may be stepping back from direct engagement in the region. For allies, this raises concerns about reliability. For adversaries, it may present an opportunity. Because when a dominant force withdraws from strategically critical ground, it does not just create space. It invites movement. Movement from rival powers, movement from non-state actors, movement from groups waiting for exactly this kind of opening. And once that movement begins, it becomes much harder to contain. This is why military analysts are not just focused on what has been lost, but on what could replace it. Will local forces be able to hold control? Will regional powers expand their influence? Will dormant threats begin to resurface? Each of these questions points to the same underlying reality. The strategic importance of these bases was never just about presence. It was about prevention. Prevention of escalation, prevention of instability, prevention of power vacuums. Now, with that layer of prevention suddenly reduced, the region is entering a new phase, one defined not by stability, but by uncertainty. And in a place where uncertainty has historically led to conflict, that shift carries consequences far beyond the battlefield. As the situation continues to unfold, attention is now shifting from what happened to how experts are interpreting it. Because in moments like this, raw events only tell part of the story. The deeper meaning often comes from those who study patterns, intelligence analysts, military strategists, and geopolitical researchers who spend years tracking signals that most people never see. And right now, many of those voices are raising the same concern. This may not be an isolated decision. It may be part of a larger strategic shift. According to early intelligence assessments, the speed of the withdrawal suggests that this was not purely logistical. Rapid military disengagements are typically driven by one of two factors, either an imminent threat environment or a high-level strategic recalibration that prioritizes redeployment over regional presence. Some analysts believe it could be both. Recent intelligence chatter, though not fully public, has reportedly indicated increased coordination among militia groups operating in Iraq and Syria. These groups, many aligned with Iranian interests, have intensified surveillance of U.S. positions and, in some cases, escalated low-level attacks. From a force protection standpoint, that creates a dangerous equation: limited troop presence, rising threat levels, and highly exposed forward positions. In that context, a rapid withdrawal begins to look less surprising. But others in the intelligence community are pointing to a different possibility: a deliberate repositioning of U.S. military assets. Several defense analysts suggest that rather than fully exiting the region, the United States may be shifting toward a more flexible, over-the-horizon strategy, relying on remote strike capabilities, naval assets, and regional air bases outside immediate conflict zones. This approach reduces direct exposure while maintaining operational reach. However, it comes with trade-offs: less on-the-ground intelligence, reduced coordination with local forces, slower response times in rapidly evolving situations. And those trade-offs are exactly what concern many experts. At major international security institutes, researchers have begun warning that sudden withdrawals, especially without clear communication, can create perception gaps that adversaries exploit, not necessarily through immediate attack, but through gradual expansion. Power vacuums are rarely filled overnight, one regional analyst noted. They are tested first, then expanded into. Military strategists are also closely watching how regional actors respond in the coming days. If Iranian-aligned groups increase movement near former U.S. positions, it could signal an attempt to consolidate influence. If extremist networks begin reactivating cells in previously monitored areas, it may indicate a resurgence phase. Both scenarios would confirm what many experts fear: that the absence of U.S. presence is not neutral. It actively reshapes behavior on the ground. There is also concern within diplomatic circles. Former officials have emphasized that alliances in the Middle East rely heavily on consistency. Sudden shifts, especially those that appear uncoordinated, can weaken trust between partners, making future cooperation more difficult. And in a region where cooperation is often fragile to begin with, that matters a lot. Still, not all analysis is pessimistic. Some policy experts argue that reducing military footprint could lower long-term tensions, particularly with Iran, by removing one of the most direct sources of confrontation. In this view, less presence could mean fewer flashpoints. But even those voices acknowledge a critical condition: any reduction must be managed carefully. Because without a structured transition, the risks may outweigh the benefits. Right now, the overwhelming consensus among experts is not that this decision is inherently wrong, but that its success or failure will depend entirely on what happens next, how quickly gaps are filled, who fills them, and whether new forms of stability can emerge before old threats return. Because in geopolitics, actions are only the beginning. It is the reactions that define the outcome. But the other side has a point. While much of the initial reaction has framed this withdrawal as destabilizing or even dangerous, there is a competing interpretation emerging from policy circles, diplomatic observers, and segments of strategic analysis. One that challenges the assumption that a continued U.S. military presence is the only path to stability. From this perspective, the sudden abandonment of bases may not be a failure of strategy, but a correction. For years, critics of prolonged U.S. engagement in the Middle East have argued that maintaining forward operating bases in active conflict zones creates more risk than it mitigates. They point to repeated cycles of escalation, where the presence of U.S. forces becomes a focal point for attacks, retaliation, and proxy confrontations. In that context, withdrawal is not retreat. It is risk reduction. Supporters of this view argue that American bases have increasingly become targets rather than stabilizers, drawing fire from militia groups, triggering diplomatic crises, and keeping the United States locked in a pattern of reactive defense. Remove the target, and you remove the trigger. There is also a broader strategic argument at play.